Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Anant Malhotra, Additional Professor in the Department of Neurosurgery, SGPJMS, Lucknow. I will be talking about the anatomical considerations for OLIF. Now, before I talk about the anatomical considerations of OLIF proper, just a few words about the various approaches that we have for the interbody fusion. If you go dead posteriorly, we have the PLIF, as you can see here, and in the coronal section, as you can see here. And this is one of the techniques which, as spine surgeons, we are much more well conversed with. And if you go slightly more laterally, we have, or the posteriorly, we have the TLIF. If you go that anteriorly, we have the ALIF approach, that is the anterior lumbar interbody fusion, as you can see here, and this is one of the best suited approaches for L5S1 level. Then you can go that laterally, that is the lateral lumbar interbody fusion or the XLIF. And then if you go anterior laterally, you have the OLIF approach, and this is also known as the ATP, that is the anterior to SWAS approach. In the corner section, you can see here that you are going through the SWAS muscle in LLF and you're going anterior to the SWAS muscle as OLIF. Now, what is the primary difference between LLF and OLIF? LLF is a much more direct approach in which you could dead laterally and a better decompression of the disc space can be there, and so a larger cage can be used as far as the LLF is and OLIF is concerned. But the problem is that you have to go through the psoas muscle, and as we shall see in subsequent slides, the psoas muscle actually houses the lumbar plexus. So there's always a chance of injury to the lumbar plexus, and to avoid that, you have to use intraoperative neuromonitoring. To circumvent that risk, OLIF was developed in which you have to go anterior to the psoas muscle and you have to take an oblique trajectory, and that is why this is known as the OLIF. Now, the structures that are important for OLIF are the first of all are the three muscles which form the anterior abdominal wall, that is the external, internal, and the external internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle. Then you have the psoas muscle, which you can see here is housing the lumbar plexus. Then you have the peritoneal cavity, the retroperitoneal space, along with the retroperitoneal structures, especially the ureter. The great vessels are there, and the sympathetic chain is there. So let us take that one by one. I'm not going into the details of where do you want to place the incision. That shall be taken up by the subsequent author, what position the patient should be in. Now, once you have placed the skin incision, then you have dissected off the subcutaneous fat, then you encounter the external oblique fascia, which needs to be sharply incised. Once you sharply incise external oblique fascia, then you have the three muscles, that is the external oblique, the internal oblique, and the transversus abdominis muscle. The important thing is that the dissection of the abdominal muscles is a blunt dissection, and you have to do the dissection along the direction of the fibers. Now, what is important here while we are doing the dissection of these three muscles is that sometimes that these three nerves, the subcostal nerve, the iliohypogastric nerve, and the ilioinguinal nerve might come in your way, especially between the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle. When you're working between the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle, you have to be very careful not to injure these vessels depending upon the level at which you're operating upon. You have to preserve these nerves, because if this injury to these nerves, then the chances are that patient might land up with a patch of hyperesthesia on the anterior or the lateral abdominal wall, which might be very discomforting for the patient. Now, once you enter into the abdominal cavity, you primarily firstly what you do is you try to hit the quadratus lumborum muscle, and then you slide your finger over the psoas muscle, and then you push on to the retroperitoneal content anteriorly, so that you can develop a space between the aorta and the psoas muscle here. So coming to the psoas muscle, which is perhaps one of the most important landmarks for the OLIF. So psoas muscle actually has two parts, the superficial part and the deep part. In on the left side of the diagram, in this diagram, you can see on the right side, the psoas muscle is attached. The deeper part of the psoas muscle attaches to the transverse process of from L1 to L5 vertebra, and the superficial part attaches to the later surface of the vertebral body from T12 to L4. And between the superficial and the deep belly lies the lumbar plexus. And this is extremely important to understand because the psoas muscle forms the lateral boundary of the OLIF. Now here you can see, just continuing with the dissection of the psoas muscle, on the right side of this diagram you can see the psoas muscle is there and the genitofemoral nerve is penetrating the superficial belly of um, the psoas muscle, and you can see here, but this usually comes quite later, so you are not much worried about the genitofemoral nerve because that is quite slightly away from your working area. But here, once the part of the psoas muscle has been removed, then you can see the lumbar plexus has been exposed. Now, if you look carefully, the nerves associated with the lumbar plexus are much more medially in the lower part of the lumbar vertebrae. That is why what happens is when you move more caudally, the lumbar plexus becomes more superficial and tends to become more medially, and that is why operating at L5S1 level using the Olip technique is slightly more tricky, because the lumbar plexus might come in your way, might get injured if you are not very careful. So these are the other the two nerves that which are very important, neural structures which are very important in with relation to the psoas muscle. You also have the sympathetic chain, which is on the lateral border of the vertebral body. You have to be careful while placing the retractors or the tubular retractors not to injure the sympathetic chain. Now coming to the great vessels, we all know that the aorta and the inferior vena cava. The aorta bifurcates into the iliac vessels at the lower border of the L4 level. You have to see it on the MRI whether it is bifurcating at a higher level or at a lower level, so that you can decide your trajectories, that what approach has to be used. Now, the once the aorta bifurcates into the iliac vessels, you can see the space between the psoas muscle and the aorta is significant out here. But here, as you move below, the gap between the iliac vessels and the psoas muscle is significantly reduced, and this is another reason why operating at L5S1 level using the Olifacting is slightly more tricky, because of the reduced space between the vessel and the psoas muscle. And apart from that, other reason why people usually avoid L5S1 OLIF is the presence of the iliac crest. However, people are doing a transiliac approach to L5S1 level for OLIF. That can be done, but there are other approaches which can be seen. Now, just moving on to the diagram on the right side, you can see here that we have the ureter. The ureter actually courses, initially it courses medially at L2, L3 level, and then it courses laterally, and then again comes medially to enter into the renal bladder. But that this medial direction is, or medial course is quite at a lower level. It is at about S3, L4, S3, S4 level, in which we're not concerned with. So it is at the L2, L3 level in which the ureter is slightly more medially and more chances of injury can take place. We shall see in the subsequent slides. So the other vascular structures which are important are the renal arteries, L1, L2, and L2, L3 level, depending upon the right or the left kidney. But perhaps more important are the segmental lumbar arteries, which are direct branches of the aorta, and they course posterior laterally over the vertebral body. And so meticulous dissection of the vertebral body and over the disc space has to be done, so that these vessels are not injured. If these vessels are injured, then significant amount of blood loss can there, which might become very difficult to even to control. Now, another important vessel that might be encountered is the iliolumbar vein, especially at the L5 level. So, how to prevent that? Many people actually advocate not to use the fixating screws at L5 level. That can be done, but if you have to use the fixating screws, then what needs to be done is you need to do a meticulous dissection over the vertebral body. See that none of the segmental artery or any of the veins is not there, so that the vascular injury, can be minimized or negated. Now, once you are doing the dissection, once you're pushing the retroperitoneal fat along with the contents anteriorly, so you will push the retroperitoneal fat along the contents. What happens is the ureter also moves along with the retroperitoneal fat anteriorly, and so you need not worry much about the chances of injury to the ureter. However, at the upper level, as I had mentioned earlier, at L2, L3 level, because the ureter is slightly more medially, one has to be more careful while doing the dissector, and also while placing the tubular retractors. Tubular retractor can injure two things. One is the ureter, and as I had mentioned earlier, the sympathetic chain. Once another injury, another thing that will come, well, that you encounter is the peritoneum. Usually, the peritoneal injury can occur during the dissection of the transverse abdominal muscles from the peritoneum. Even if there is an injury, you can simply suture it with the catgut or a Weichel suture, but try to avoid the injury. What you need to do is what you do have to do is you have to dissect as literally as possible. If you dissect as literally as possible, then the chances are you will land up in the retroperitoneal space into the retroperitoneal fat. So the chances of injury to the peritoneal structures or peritoneum shall be significantly reduced. I'm not going to the details of the preoperative evaluation. The important things to look at the MRI is the aorta and the inferior vena cava. You need to see the distance between the aorta and the psoas muscle, so that you can see the distance. And distance should be at least a meter. Sorry, at least 1 centimeter, so that you can work between these two region. That is the aorta on one hand and the psoas muscle on the other hand. So this is all about the anatomy of the that is related to the olive, and in the subsequent lectures you will learn about the procedure, the indications, and the complications associated with them. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, hello, hello.
Yes, Rakesh, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I really apologize for the technical problem, and I was with the echo, so I was not able to appreciate what is going on. So I am really sorry for that one. Thank you, Dr. Anand, for the excellent coverage of all the important aspects. Thank you again. Now, heading on the session, our next speaker for today is Dr. Umesh Srikantha, who is currently working as senior consultant neurosurgeon Aster CMI Hospital, Bangalore. He is going to set some lights on the coverage of pre-operative radiological evaluation of planning for OLIF. Now, Dr. Srikantha, please take the session on. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Umesh Srikanta, and I thank the STPGIMS team for giving me this opportunity to talk on this interesting topic. I'm going to be talking on OLIF and the pre-operative investigations and the radiological planning that goes along with it. Uh, yeah. So as we know, there are several indications in the present day for an OLIF, and it's ever expanding, and the indications are actually increasing day to day. Grade 1 listhesis, whether it's degenerative or lytic listhesis, are ideal indications for OLIF. Lumbar canal stenosis with no severe central stenosis. Degenerative scoliosis, actually it has changed the entire management scenario as far as degenerative scoliosis is considered. Discogenic pain that is necessitating surgery, where handling of the neural structures will be kept to as minimum as possible. Pseudoarthrosis after failed posterior fusion. Post-infective instability with no active disease as or an epidural compression. These are some of the indications for OLIF surgery. But if we consider in more detail, even within these indications also, there are some cases which are suitable for OLIF, and there are some cases which are not. So coming to the factors that need to be considered as far as selecting the cases are for OLIF is considered, we need to see whether these cases are suitable for the approach per se, that is whether they are, the approach is feasible in these particular cases. And there are several factors that are, considered under this category, which we will discuss in detail. The second thing is whether the OLIF or the indirect decompression is going to be efficacious or is going to treat the pathology in an adequate manner as intended, or whether we are going to reduce the pathology or reduce the deformity in an effective way using this particular indirect decompression technique. The third possibility is whether, when dealing with complex pathologies, whether OLIF is a significantly good approach, and whether it can mitigate the risks that are involved in treating these complex pathologies. So these are the factors that we need to consider. We'll go discuss them one by one. Suitability of approach, of course, iliac crest was one of the main factors that we used to consider while dealing with trans-psoas approaches. For OLIF, it's not such a big deal because we approach from anterior, and then through the orthogonal maneuver we can place the cage that in a horizontal position into the long axis of the disc, and that decreases the effect or the obstruction that the iliac crest can cause even while treating at L4-5 pathology in these particular cases. What has become more important, of course, which was not so much in a lateral trans-psoas approach, is the vascular anatomy. As we know, the OLIF corridor exists between the anterior border of the psoas muscle and the lateral border of the either the aorta or the iliac vessels, either the iliac vein or most likely the iliac vein or the iliac artery in some cases. So this is a very small window, and we know that this window, if it is more than 1 centimeter, and that is considered safe. And if you look at these images, all of these images are at L4-5, though the window may be adequate in some cases and we may be very good in some cases, but in some cases, even at the same level, the window may actually be absent. And this is something that we need to actually consider in a very detailed manner while selecting a case for a oblique interbody approach. Of course, there are some cases where we feel that the vessel is very close to the anterior border and there is not enough space between the anterior border of the psoas and the vessels. But we know, and it has been shown in several studies as well, that in the lateral decubitus position, when we stretch the psoas muscle, the vessels tend to move away from the anterior border. The psoas becomes more taut, and hence the window that is there between these two structures actually increases, and that is favorable. So if you find a case where actually the window is very, very narrow, even these cases, not initially, but of course over a period of time, these cases can be considered for approach for an OLIF approach or an anterior to psoas approach in certain cases, because we expect this window to increase when we put the patient in a lateral decubitus position. We need to consider the vascular anomalies, which sometimes may be detected in a routine preoperative investigation like an MRI. Routine preoperative CT is not recommended in all the cases unless it is certain but indicated in certain particular instances. But of course, whether to specifically look for these abnormalities, which actually is present in a very significant number of patients, that is nearly around 40% of patients, according to one study, have shown to have some amount of a vascular abnormality around the vertebral area, as far as which may impact the OLIF approach. But whether to actually do specific investigations to look for these anomalies or not, we'll consider it a little bit in detail a little later. Of course, the other factors that are ureter and the retroperitoneal fat, we need not go into too much of a detail. We know that the ureter is situated close to the anterior border of the psoas in the retroperitoneum, especially at L3-4, L4-5. And as we can see in this video, in many cases, we can visualize the ureter either through a thin facial layer, or there will be a thick facial layer along with some fat, which can be easily separated if we are maintaining the facial planes. And then we can go across the ureter in order to reach the anterior border of the psoas. And it has been shown that in 16% of the cases, in all cases, almost all cases, the ureter comes in way of the surgical corridor. But in 16% of the cases, it is very, very close to the area, to our approach, and there is a potential risk of injury. We have also to note the retroperitoneal fat, because in thin individuals, sometimes we are approaching very much anteriorly, and the retroperitoneal fat may disappear, or it may be very, very thin layer in those particular cases. So we need to approach and we need to enter the right retroperitoneal space in order to go into the OLIF corridor. So this is something that we need to take precautions, and we can find out. The second category, which is very important category, is the efficacy of indirect decompression, whether we are actually selecting OLIF in the right case as far as the pathology is considered. And so, as you know, OLIF acts by the principle of interbody distraction and ligamentotaxis. And if we are not able to distract the interbody, or if the ligaments are not lax or flexible enough to achieve this kind of a ligamentotaxis, then the whole idea of this indirect decompression and hence resolving the underlying pathology is not serving its purpose. So we need to consider factors which are either going to limit or going to restrict the amount of interbody distraction that we can achieve as far as an OLIF is considered. And there are several of these factors. We need to consider facet arthrosis or capsular calcification, which is one of the most common factors that is neglected, because in the presence of such a severe facetal hypertrophy or a calcification, doing an anterior interbody distraction is just going to result in a reverse compressive forces, though it may increase the lordosis in the initial phase, but the amount of compressive forces that are acting may result in cage subsidence in a later period. And of course, presence of calcifications like this, overhanging facets, or like this, or the capsular calcification may prevent any kind of a distraction or any kind of a reduction that we are planning to achieve. These things should be taken into consideration. Of course, the other factors that are chronicity of the case, whether it's a collapsed disc space, whether it's the presence of an anterior or a lateral bridging osteophyte, these things may obviously prevent any kind of a distraction or a reduction maneuver, whether irrespective of the approach. And these also should be considered in due manner as far as planning and pre-OLIF case is considered. One of the ways that has been shown in some cases to consider how much flexible the spine is or how much anterior distraction we can achieve is by getting what we call as a full extension lateral view X-ray. So as you can see, this is an example where despite a full extension lateral view, the lordosis is increasing by only around 5%, and this is the maximum amount of lordosis that we can probably achieve by anterior distraction. The further distraction may be limited by chronic ALL shortening or due to several other factors that we can find out. Whereas in some cases, despite there being multi-level listhesis and multi-level anterior shortening, but through a full extension lateral view. As you can see here, it is the same patient. The entire vertebral body are coming back into its place. Good reduction can be achieved, and hence these are the ideal cases where OLIF can be done, as is being shown in this particular example. Of course, the second category of patients where we need to consider is where indirect decompression may not help at all. In these cases, these are the cases where there is a medial lip of supraarticular process hypertrophy, where there is a front back canal stenosis. As we can see there, when there is a medial lip of facetal hypertrophy that is compressing the traversing nerve root, in these cases, any amount of distraction is not going to cause any effective release of the traversing nerve root in these cases, and these cases are not ideal for an OLIF procedure or for an indirect decompression per se. Foraminal stenosis, front back foraminal stenosis, these kind of stenosis are very ideal in the sense where is the up-down stenosis, where by just distracting the disc space, we are moving the compressive element away from the nerve root, we are lifting the nerve root. These kind of cases are very ideal. But those that are due to a combination of either a superior facetal hypertrophy and an osteophyte, or a posterior disc osteophyte together compressing the nerve root, these cases are not very ideal for an indirect decompression. Of course, severe central canal stenosis pathology cannot be addressed by an indirect decompression, and these are not very ideal cases. So again, the third complex, that is the pathology of complex pathologies, where there is a high grade listhesis, or there is a severe scoliosis where the coronal cab is more than 40, or lateral listhesis of more than 10, and a rotational abnormality. These may hinder, especially in the initial stages. It is a definite no, but as experience progresses, of course, these cases can easily be tackled, actually are better tackled with an lateral approach rather than a posterior approach in these cases. Of course, so what are the investigations that are needed in order for us to plan adequately for an OLIF approach? There are standard investigations. We do, of course, a lateral flexion extension, as well as an AP standing radiographs, as well as a full length, that is a whole spine AP and a lateral images, in order to calculate the spinal, sagittal, as well as coronal parameters, and to plan how much of reduction or how much of restoration of lordosis is required. An MRI usually should involve an entire abdominal girth sequence in order to adequately plan the level, adequately plan at that particular level what are the abdominal structures that are there, and what is the amount of retroperitoneal fat that is there, which will give us idea about any unusual anomalies that are there in certain cases. I was mentioning whether we should do specifically any investigations to find out any other abnormalities like CT abdomen, or a CT angiography, or a dual contrast CT abdomen. So as studies have shown, these are, though they may detect abnormalities in a larger percentage of patients, that is nearly around 40%, 32+7, but these findings are not going to change the plan of surgery for any particular patient. And especially the radiation induced damage is there. These things should be avoided as much as possible, especially considering in the present day era where we are doing an intraoperative OM or intraoperative 3D imaging technique, where it may further add to the radiation exposure that is sustained by the patient. MR neurography is a very fancy investigation. It is not required as far as OLIF is concerned, which was more important for a lateral transverse approaches, and I'm not going to detail about that. So just to summarize, for a successful OLIF surgery, adequate yet judicious investigations, appropriate case selection, meticulous planning, as well as perfect execution. So these are the cornerstones of how we need to plan, how we need to think, and how we can do a successful OLIF surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shrikanta, for a brilliant presentation and excellent delivery of the preoperative planning. Now, moving to on with the session, our next speaker for today is Dr. Sudhir Dubey, who is currently working as Assistant Director at the Department of Neurosciences at Medanta Hospital, Gurgaon. Dr. Dubey is going to share with us his valuable knowledge and experience by showing us the surgical steps for the OLIF. So I will request Dr. Dubey to kindly enlighten us, please. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Greetings from Medanta, the Medicity. On behalf of my team, Dr. Deepak Bangale, Dr. Satyakam, and Dr. Himanshu, and myself, Dr. Sudhir Dubey, will be presenting step-by-step approach of oblique lateral interbody fusion. This is a typical case of L4-5 listhesis. And as you can see on the X-ray, there's a listhesis which is there, and there's a canal stenosis at that level, and there's a degeneration. So first we start with positioning. After general anesthesia, we position the patient in lateral position, supporting both the arms. The leg is slightly flexed and supported so that the patient is dead on the lateral view is dead on from the lateral point of view. We mark the various levels of the disc. In this case, it is the 4-5, and we use intraoperative monitoring. Skin incision is most important. It's along external oblique lines. And we go on dissecting first external oblique, then we see the internal oblique like this. And then we further dissect. Then we see the transverse abdominis. These are the flat fibers. And then we put a dissector along with our probe, and we see the disc, and we put a guide wire inside. And then we confirm with the C-arm shot where exactly we are, and we dilate the tract. Once we have dilated the tract and we have put the self-retaining retractor, we again check our positions where exactly we exist. And this is where we are. So now the thing is under microscope. Previously, it's under a naked eye. Now, once you have this, in this we have, because it's a oblique lateral interbody fusion, you are anterior to the source. So there may be some fibers of the source which may still come in, but we gradually make the space, go on dissecting it down, checking our levels at each position, our AP and the lateral slots. And we go on creating a plane on the bone. This is the disc level. This is the vertebral body above and below. So we go on creating these levels which are there, and we go on doing the removal of the disc progressively. The disc has to be taken out. You have to be gentle though. Sometimes the degeneration is quite severe. There may be small nodules, and that time you become more careful. And then if you have a lot of degeneration, don't use this instrument. This is a shaver. But for not so degenerated disc, this is an ideal instrument to use. Now then you use a trial. You go inside, and as you go inside, you do the tilt. This is the orthogonal maneuver where you tilt it on the side. So this is how the spacer looks. This you can calculate the height and the disc space. So progressively you use these instruments. You use the dilators progressively, which increase in size. In this case, this is around 14 millimeter. Now this is using the 16 millimeters. It's anteriorly lordotic. In this video, you can see this is the posterior part, this is the anterior part. So when you are going inside, you are in oblique fashion. And as you go inside, as you saw that, this is a maneuver in which it goes more vertically and on to the side of the body. So you want to become parallel as much as it is, and you have to see where exactly you are and where exactly you want to go. So with this, when you have done, you again take out whatever the remnants of mucks of the discs are there. And once you have removed all the remnants and you have made sure there is no disc material there, you prepare the disc, and then you put the lordotic side in front and the non-lordotic behind. And this in the Surgicel, you have put all the graft taken from, harvested from local bone, or with, sometimes in some cases, you can use bone morphogenic protein. So this is how it is going. So now orthogonal maneuver, so make it as anterior as possible. And you have tried to put the disc as much forward as possible. You're still to go a long way. So now you have put it inside. So you are balanced on both sides. And here you are inside where this thing is there. To check for the bleeding, you put some Surgicel, hemostasis. So in this case, there was no oozing. But still you have to check when you take out the pin, whether any oozing is there or not. Hemostasis is pretty important because otherwise it may ooze. It's a potential cavity, the retroperitoneal space. So in this case, we have put a lot of Surgicel. I think it is more than what is required. A gel foam would have done the same work. Because you need to put some weight here. See, you can see a minimal ooze there, but it is now settling. So a gel foam will do the trick. Because gel foam, as it absorbs blood, it will increase in size, and with its own weight, it will be able to press it. So now you can see that it has settled down. Now you take out the screws on the sides. And once you have removed the screws, you check it and you come out like this. This will be followed by closure, a layered closure where fascia has to be closed. And also you need to finish this procedure. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Dubey, for a wonderful talk. I'm sure this is going to help many of us with our doubts and queries. Moving on with the session, last but not least, I would like to invite our next speaker for today is Dr. Manas Panigari, who is a senior consultant neurosurgeon at KIPS Hospital, Hyderabad. Dr. Panigari is going to share some important knowledge of the various complications we can incur during the surgery and the steps to avoid that. Now I would like to invite Dr. Panigari to talk on the session, please. Thanks.
Yeah, can you allow me to share my screen?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, please proceed.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh, and thank Dr. Sanjay, Dr. Anant, and Dr. Jayesh for organizing this symposium. Everything is running in time and so well organized. My job is to tell on complications and avoidance. I've not done many cases to have so many complications, but then so I have taken of my complications as well as from the literature. What are the possible complications and how it can be avoided? Many of my slides have been already spoken by Dr. Anant and Umesh, so there'll be some repetition. As Dr. Anant said that anteriorly there are basically three approaches. One is A-leaf and X-leaf and O-leaf. Because you had a lot of complications with A-leaf, a lot of vascular complications with A-leaf, and retrograde ejaculation with A-leaf, people thought X-leaf or D-leaf is better. But D-leaf, as Dr. Anant was telling, one has to go through the psoas or through the psoas muscle. Then there's a potential chance of damaging the lumbosacral plexus. As one works through the psoas muscle, the lumbosacral plexus damaged, the chances of weakness is high. And then in these cases, one has to do neuro monitoring. So to overcome this complication, people started doing OLIF. Here in OLIF, we don't have to do an neuro monitoring. It's not mandatory because that is the advantage over XLIF or DLIF. Some people use neurography as an alternative to find out where to avoid dissecting. Means in the upper part, L2 to L4 is not a problem, but when one comes down, the lumbosacral plexus overlaps on the posterior half of the body. So sometimes it's difficult. It's not a mandatory to do neurography, as Dr. Srikanth told. It is just to have an idea that how is the anatomical orientation. If you divide the body of the lumbar into 4 segments, each 25%, in the L2, L3, L4, the posterior 50% has the most of the lumbar plexus, but when it comes down, even the anterior part has the part of the lumbosacral plexus. Then it becomes a little tricky. That is why one people avoid doing L5S1 OLIF. So till L4-5 it's okay, but when one has to resect or displace the anterior border of the psoas at L5, there's a chance that there can be some weakness or because of nerve damage. So basically, the two people have divided the body into Morris zones 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2 is safe to work, and 3 has the psoas muscle and with the lumbosacral plexus. Most of the time, zone 3 and zone 4 has 90% of the time the lumbosacral plexus and it differs between right and left. But most of the time we work on the left side, so one has to know that 90% one has to work in the front half of the front 50%. Now, Dakar also divided the similar way that the anterior half of the body is most safe. Whether we do an OLIF, it's always better to work in the anterior half. But be caution is in L5, the anterior half also is not very safe. Like the anterior zone only is safe. To overcome all this, OLIF has the advantage, but then in the lower part, one has to be careful. Now, it's not that OLIF doesn't have complications. There has been a lot of publication on complications since 1997. It has been promoted. You can see here over a period of time, people have published their complications, but then it is quite less compared to the other anterior approaches. The intraoperative complications is almost 1.5%, and the post-operative is 9 to 10%. Fortunately, these post-op complications are not persistent. They usually are transitory, and they have relief within 30 days. And most of the time, the most commonest complication is hypoesthesia due to damage of hypogastric or ilioinguinal nerve, as Dr. Anant was explaining. In addition to the other common complication is vascular injury. I'll be explaining how to avoid and what are the causes of vascular injury, and the nerve damage, as I explained. There can be contralateral nerve root injury also, and sympathetic chain injury. The sympathetic chain has to be avoided because many times if it's damaged, people complain of change of the temperature. They'll be they keep on, one of my patients kept on complaining of increased temperature in the site of surgery. So sympathetic chain has to be saved. All the nerves has to be saved, and the vessels also has to be saved. This anatomy has already been explained that the genitofemoral is on the psoas, and you have the ureter here, you have the sympathetic chain, and you have the segmental vessels. Vascular injury is not very common. It is 2% incident. To avoid that, as Dr. Srikanth told, one has to look at the MRI. The distance between the anterior border of the psoas to the aorta should be minimum 1 centimeter. But then if it's less, as he was explaining, one can do a CT scan in the lateral decubitus position and then see whether the space can be increased or not. If it's less than 1 centimeter, and if you still want to do OLIF, one can do a CT scan with the lateral decubitus position, and can see here that the distance increased to so that one can decide whether to do it or not. We'll also do plan the skin incision depending on the lateral decubitus position. But we have been doing with the fluoroscopy, mark the disc space and then do the incision anterior to the disc space obliquely. To avoid the commonest cause of bleeding is damage to the segmental artery and or vein, the vascular bleeding. But fortunately, if one knows the anatomy, one can avoid damage because most of the time the segmental artery remains in the upper part of the body. So, so when one places the pin, it is easy to place the pin in the lower in the upper body on the lower side, but one has to probably avoid putting the pin on the lower side, and especially at L5. As you can see here, also the second distinct that always is better because this area has no vessels, so one can usually place the pin, upper pin. The lower pin it's better to avoid, but if you don't have a vessel, you can place it. But most of the time, if you put a one pin also, doing an OLIF is not difficult. Before placing the needle, always palpate for the disc, especially when putting the pack needle to confirm. Palpate with the finger. Do not blindly put on the bone the pack needle to confirm the disc. Palpate with the finger and then place your needle so that you're always in the disc, because the segmental vessel usually never comes on the disc space. As I was explaining, most of the work can be done with one pin also. And we have been practicing doing our work with one pin and to reduce vascular injury. So both AP and lateral with the one pin. The second most common complication is cage subsidence. It has been reported to almost 8 to 10%. Now, how do you reduce the incidence of cage subsidence? One has to be very careful, especially in elderly people with osteoporotic. In osteoporotic, because there is a lot of change in the density when you put a OLIF graft. So what we have done is we put just iliacrest graft in the shape of an OLIF when we do an anterior approach, and then do posterior fixation. We do not use the graft. But there are some steps to prevent subsidence. One is proper placement. It should be in the middle third and it should be from pedicle to pedicle, as Dr. Sudhir showed in his surgery. So to have that, one has to, the entry point should be the proper place. If one enters the disc at the center or at the junction of the anterior third and the middle third, then when one places the tubular retractor, we have to work at the center of the body. If one places anterior or posterior, the chances of case migrating or subsidence is higher. And one also has to look at the bone density of the body. When one always go till the opposite side, break the spurs on the opposite side so that one can place the graft from one pedicle to the other pedicle. One has to cross the opposite pedicle and reach this so that the graft subsidence or migration incidence can be reduced. As you can see here, the graft has been placed from beyond the pedicles on both sides. The second step is avoid aggressive end plate removal, and then use adequate bone graft in your graft in the OLIF cage. While using this, do not be very aggressive in removing the epiphyseal plate. That also has a higher chance of graft subsidence. Be very gentle, use the proper size. Don't be over aggressive in putting larger and larger size, because hammering the sizer also can has a chance of breaking the body, and that can cause persistent pain. There is a case report of vertebral body fracture. I'll show you in the later slide. So what we want to achieve is to have the cage from one pedicle to the other pedicle and the central part of the body. The third precaution is always add lateral or posterior fixation. Many people believe in doing standalone OLIF, though it is not approved. Maybe single level is fine to do a standalone, but more than one level is always add posterior or lateral fixation, or the chances of case subsidence is higher. Like this case, first we did the OLIF and then we supplemented with the posterior fixation with percutaneous fixation. If not posterior, like this case, we did a lateral fixation. But now we have Olive case where you can put the screws on that side without the rod also. So it's always better to add fixation to prevent subsidence. Now, this was a case report of malposition where they're not placed properly. Now, this is what happens if one does not place it in the center or does being aggressive in removing the epiphyseal plate. And this is what happens to the cage. There is a subsidence, and this they have done 3 level, and they had not supplemented with posterior fixation also. So if you are doing more than 1 level, always fix it. Never do over aggressive epiphyseal plate removal, and osteoporotic spine, be careful. So this is again another case report where there is a fracture of the body because of over distraction. So do not be over aggressive and distracting. Do whatever is appropriate for that patient. Ureteral incidence injury is not very high. Usually it is detected post-operatively, not intraoperatively. Fortunately, the ureter is adherent to the peritoneum, and it remains within this slide. Dr. Srikanth also showed that it remains within the 2 fascia, anterior and posterior fascia of the renal fascia. So if one does reflects the peritoneum, then normally one does not damage the ureter. So if you don't look for the ureter, you will not damage. If you look for ureter, there is a chance of damage. So reflect the peritoneum along with the ureter, the chances of ureteral damage will be less. Sympathetic chain injury also is less than 1 to 2% as reported in literature. Usually they complain of differential temperature in legs if damaged. The sympathetic chain normally lies in the anterior third of the body. So as Dr. Ananth also has stressed, that is better to place the tubular retractor behind the sympathetic chain to avoid damage, because the sympathetic chain is the anterior third of the body. So always place the tubular retractor behind the sympathetic chain, in between the psoas and the sympathetic chain, to prevent damage to the sympathetic chain. The one more complication, which is only case reports, is contralateral nerve root injury. We work OLIF, it is actually obliquely placed, but when you place the cage, it is transversely along this. So many times you have to shift the reflect, take the anterior part of the psoas to get the angle. With this, there are chances that you can damage some lumbosacral plexus, especially at L4-5. But if you do not do that, you directly push in your cage, then there are chances that you can have the dural tear or a disc coming out and compressing the opposite side foramen. So this is what has to be avoided. If one does that like this, you can have a post-op deficit on the opposite side or a dural tear. So always place the cage in the center, and the trajectory should be in the proper plane. The weakness is not all the time because of a nerve injury. It can be because of psoas muscle injury or a psoas hematoma. So hemostasis has to be achieved properly. Do not damage the psoas muscle, and always remember this anatomy of the lumbosacral plexus on the segments of the vertebral body. The most irritating complication is post-op numbness and paresthesia. It's quite high, almost 10%, but fortunately they are temporary. So attempt is to preserve all the nerves, avoid excessive flexion while positioning the patient, because that can cause neuropraxia, and if it develops also, reassure the patient, treat symptomatically. Most of the time they recover. The last complication is radiation dose to the patient and staff. As many times you have to use this fluoroscopy. All the time we think of only the radiation to us, like patient and the staff, to the doctor around. But then there's a radiation dose also to the patient, especially their young patients. So one has to also think of the number of shots which can be used. So people have started, we have not done navigation guided only, where you can do do with the O-arm. They have the O-arm, but they are not used. And then do everything with navigation guided, probably it reduces the radiation dose to the patient and to the hospital staff. And this is the meta-analysis, the pool data. So which I've already explained, of 1400 cases of OLIF with the complication rate, which I've already explained. In conclusion, OLIF is a minimal invasive procedure. It has lesser complication compared to other anterior procedures, and long-term follow-up has a similar, the pain relief is similar to the other OLIF procedures with lesser morbidity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Panigiri, for your brilliant delivery of lecture. It indeed would be it indeed would be helpful to avoid the surgeon's nightmare. Thank you very much once again. It's have been a brilliant session with lots of knowledge and personal experience sharing. Now it's time to discuss for all the doubts and queries. There are many questions and queries regarding the OLIF procedures. As we know, this is not a common procedure at the posterior one, TLIF and all. So I would like to start first with the personal experience of all the eminent faculty and panelists. And I will like to start with Dr. Varun Agarwal. For the, like you have all the surgical tools in your armamentarium. So now for your personal experience, what are the common indication in your practice for the OLIF?
So first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Jayesh and SGPJ for inviting me to be the panelist on this session. It has been a very interesting conference and a very informative OLIF session also. And this is a very common question which everybody keeps asking: what is the indication and why should we, switch over from TLIF to OLIF? So in my practice, particularly, you find that deformity corrective aspect of a large cage on the anterior side, which is much more useful and much more achievable in an OLIF procedure than compared to a TLIF procedure. So in degenerative cases where there is a degenerative scoliosis or things like that, I do tend to prefer the OLIF procedure. The pre-operative reading of the imaging and the MRI is most important, and that is where you can judge whether the indirect decompression alone would be helpful, or do you need to do an additional posterior decompression. So that is one thing. Meticulously read your MRIs, and for me, multi-level deformity cases where OLIF trumps over TLIF for me.
Okay. So any comments from the another panelist, Dr. Ramesh Chandra, please?
Yeah. Hello.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'm audible.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. For simple cases like single level listhesis, if you see, there is not much difference between OLIF and TLIF. So we have done a prospective analysis between the both the groups and found that return to work is quite early in OLIF cases, and hospital stay and requirement of analgesia is quite less in OLIF cases for single level thing. But as Dr. Varun pointed out, in degenerative scoliosis especially, the segmental alignment, sagittal alignment is better provided with OLIF. And now OLIF with multiple posterior column osteotomies, if you do, it has almost replaced the need for PSOs. So that is one area I think in future OLIF may take over in cases of degenerative scoliosis. Now coming to the initial imaging and all, Dr. Srikanth had covered it completely. So what I would like to point out here is, though if you take some 100 patients of L4-5 listhesis and do the MRI, around 20% will in our experience don't have the vascular corridor. And so these patients we won't be able to do OLIF. Another aspect what I wanted to see, I saw was even the overhang of the psoas is a major aspect in OLIF also. So if the psoas exceeds the anterior border of the vertebral body, the dissection becomes difficult. So you need to retract the psoas more so that you can expose the disc space. So that the incision, the point of incision is roughly 5 to 10 centimeters from the midpoint of the disc. So the 5 to 10 centimeters is highly variable. So if you take you should consider the body habitus of the patient. If the patient is very obese, I like to place a vertical incision so that you get some more space and your finger can reach the anterior border of the body.
We have the next question about this one. So
Yeah.
type incision for 1 level, 2 level, or 3 level. So what is your preference now?
So basically it depends upon the body habitus and the psoas overhang. So if the psoas is overhanging the anterior part of the vertebral body, if you start very posteriorly, the psoas will come in between. So in those cases, I start a bit more anterior. So instead of 5, maybe 7.5 or so, you come anteriorly so that you can get over the psoas muscle. And to make all the general surgeons, I think it's similar to a lumbar sympathectomy. Those who have done general surgery, it is like similar to a lumbar sympathectomy. But if you have forgot this thing, I think having an surgical gastroenterologist for the first 1 or 2 cases with you is advisable.
The surgeon.
Yeah, as a surgeon for the initial cases. And I usually borrow the retractors because they have those long retractors similar to a Langenbeck, but they are more broader and longer. So, and all the exposure should be done under microscope. So if you do under the microscope, you can avoid the ureter, and you don't find ureter in all the cases because once you see the retroperitoneum, the ureter, so very rarely we find the ureter, but it comes out. So you can nicely see the genitofemoral nerve, you can see the sympathetic chain, and docking of the thing you can properly do under vision. And one more thing is, all of us have been trained to in a T-lift to the disc to remove discectomy like anteriorly. So while you are doing a discectomy from the posterior, you tend to put your instruments anteriorly so that you go across and take the disc out. But if you do the same thing in OLIF, you enter into the dural tube because it lies behind. So there's just in the second or third case of me, I had a dural leak because of this movement. So always keep in your mind that your instrumentation, whether it's a discectomy forceps or clearing the disc, it should be on the orthogonal manner, right angles to it. So these are the initial things.
Thank you. So now the second question I would like to ask to Mr. Dr. Dubey and Dr. Srikanta for the tips for the positioning of the patient, which is very important in our life. So please proceed. Because the whole of the webinar is focused for the resident level and young surgeons. So what are the tips for the positioning of all?
When it's a lateral approach, LF or DLIF, then you require to be very proper aligned in that way. But OLIF, you have this thing that you can be slightly, patient can be curved forwards. So OLIF is not such a big thing, but for a direct lateral approach, then you require to be in AP positioning on C-arm. You have to see a proper X-ray on the lateral view. And proper on the AP view, you should be seeing with a 90 degree of the C-arm. But OLIF, you can have this thing, but whenever you have put the cages inside or you're putting instrument inside, you have whatever position it is, you have to take a proper lateral view and AP view. So you have to mark it accordingly. So most important is whatever the arm goes down, you have to take care of that. There's no pressure, this thing. There should be mild flexion at both the hips and at the knees also, and you should have knees adequately padded. So that is the most important thing. And you can break the tail. You should always have a amount of break, which you shouldn't use all the time. You should try to do as much with a minimal break, but you can increase the break, especially when there is a scoliosis component. You will have a component where you may have a convex side up or you may have a concave side down. So that time you have to put your intelligence and break the table according to that. And the breaking point should be at the focus where you are doing the OLIF procedure, the disc level, which should be there. And for skin incision, as you mentioned, for L4-5, I will always like to have a different incision, but for other levels, you can always move up and down. For L4-5, especially when the iliac crest is on the higher side, you cannot use the same skin incision as you would do for L3-4 also. So that becomes slight struggle. So for L2-3, L3-4, it is no brainer. You can use single that incision. But L4-5, especially when the iliac crest is just touching the L4-5 disc, then you have to have a separate incision for that.
Anything, Dr. Srikanta, you would like to add?
I think Dr. Dubey has covered it quite briefly already. The only one difference that we have done between transverse and anterior to psoas approaches is how you flex the limb, lower limb. So in a transverse approach, usually a non-dependent leg, that is whichever side was up. So that one we used to flex it because we wanted the psoas to be relaxed. But in an OLIF approach, we actually extend the left lower limb, which is
Go back.
one, so that the psoas becomes slightly. I'm not sure how much difference it actually makes, because in some cases we have actually altered the position and we have not found too much of a difference. But yeah, that is what has been recommended. I'm actually not quite sure how much of a difference it makes in an individual case by making that psoas stretch by extending that lower limb. I think the other thing is in multiple levels, usually, as Dr. Dubey was saying, with one incision, we can make even for L4-5, what we have observed is we can actually keep the same skin incision, but we can just make a separate transverse abdominis incision. Like the internal oblique, external oblique can still be split across, but the transverse abdominis is the one that prevents your retractor from moving all the way up to the lower level. So that is when you are doing 3 or more levels. So that is when actually you can just make a separate transversus abdominis incision, so that with the same skin incision, with the same other superficial muscle, abdominal muscle incision, you can still go to the next level, means to the lowermost level, that is L4-5. That is something that can be tried.
Just wanted to add one point. Rakesh, can I just add one point? I think the vertical incision and the oblique incision, the vertical incision might slightly be more useful for multiple level lesions, whereas the oblique incision is slightly more useful for a single level incision. And as Dr. Shrikanta and Ramesh also correctly pointed out, that you can have a separate incision on the transverse abdominal muscle for multiple levels. With using the same skin incision, you can then tackle multiple levels. At least 3 levels can be tackled by a single skin incision.
Yeah, obviously, if we are doing multiple levels, an oblique incision is what is always recommended.
Just one thing I would like to add in the position for the young surgeons, that we here use the vacuum bean bag for the lateral positioning, and it's very helpful. Believe me, it's very helpful. And the second thing is for the orthogonal maneuver, especially once you are operating in the adult DZN spine. So for each level, you have to adjust little bit of 5 or 10 degree. So don't try to adjust the C-arm. Try to adjust the table so the patient should be adjusted in the plane of the C-arm, not the C-arm. It's a very small but very important thing for the positioning, I believe. So next query is regarding the experience for the single position OLIF and fusion. Experience for this is question open for all the experienced faculties.
Means single
Position OLIF and fixation. So OLIF and
posterior means doing anterior OLIF and posterior fixation.
Yes, yeah. So is there any what is the experience, or what do you think that this is useful ergonomically?
If it's a grade 1 listhesis, we have done OLIF and anterior fixation only. But if it's more than grade 1, then we follow both anterior followed by posterior.
So
I think apart from what Dr. Manas just said, if it is an osteoporotic spine and if multiple levels are there, then it is always better to go posteriorly. And one more indication is, you can say that if the patient is on NSAIDs for a long time, like rheumatoid arthritis or any other immunosuppressive drugs, or NSAIDs for a long time, then you can always preferably go posteriorly, have a posterior fixation, because in such patients, bone healing becomes a problem if a patient is on long-term NSAIDs. So in such cases, you can always go posteriorly. So osteoporotic, multiple level, and as Dr. Manas said, and if the patient is on long-term NSAIDs, even on a single level, you can go posteriorly and high-grade listhesis.
So I believe Dr. Rakesh's question is regarding whether to change the position to a prone position before putting. And what I find is that the screws which are lower down are a little difficult to pass, and so is the rod in a multi-level case. In a single level case, it is quite doable. And although you have to decide whether the headache is worth it or not, because for example, in our institute, we are using navigation, which is a little.
That's why I'm asking Dr. Varun.
Is a little
because
painful, you have a little leeway. You have to position the patient a little posteriorly onto the table so that your hand can drop down and you can pass that screw from down. So you have to keep that in mind, what you are trying to achieve. And what I do is I slightly tilt the table also. Once my trajectory is set, I slightly tilt the table so the hand comes up. But that I think can be done mostly in cases where you're using navigation and stuff like that, so that it is a little more your orientation doesn't change. But if you are using a fluoroscopy and you tilt the table, everything becomes oblique, and then it becomes a little difficult for you to communicate with your technician, and it becomes a hell of a job. So I would rather advise for the beginners not to go in for such kind of procedures right at the beginning, unless you have mastered the percutaneous techniques of screw fixation and etc. and OLIF etc. And stage the procedure. Staging never hurt anyone, especially the patient. And you can take the call on this after a couple of days also, that a posterior decompression is needed or not. So that balance you have to see during the procedure. And even if I try it, I always tell my patient that I may need to stage you. So don't worry, that is part of the plan. Don't think that I'm coming back and doing, resolving some kind of a problem which has happened for the first time. If it happens in the first time, then it is well and good. But they are always counseled to expect a second procedure and not panic about that.
That's good. Thank you very much.
In our practice, what we do is single level we'll put, because you have to have a patient which is slightly tilted. As you know, the pedicle screw go at L4-5 will go at 15 to 20 degrees from the sides. So you have to, once you have done the OLIF, you will tilt the patient slightly towards front, and then you can easily do it without draping again, without positioning again. But the only thing is you will be taking two shots of the O-arm, which you will be doing again, because OLIF would have changed that. So in certain cases, we tried by putting screws first and doing that, but that was becoming cumbersome, because you should first position for OLIF and do the procedure and then think about these things. And
Dr. Dubey, can you please unmute yourself?
I'm so sorry. What happens for single level patients, what we do is we will do the OLIF and tilt the patient slightly in the front, because if you have to put a L4-5 screw or L3 screw, you have to be around 15 to 25 degrees from the sides. So if you have given a forward tilt to the patient, you can do the procedure. Only thing which is required is to take the C-arm or the O-arm shot again when we do it. It's navigation guided, so it can be easily done for one level. But if you have to do a decompression again, or some amount of decompression is required, or if it's a multi-level, then we won't be doing this. And then we will be making the patient prone and doing it. Single level, we do it from the same position.
Yeah, no, that's what the robo has been promoted for that, for doing in a single position, both posterior and anterior. But doing lateral fixation has worked out very well. Low leaf and doing a lateral fixation then and there.
Yeah.
So Dr. Rakesh, one strategy that quite a few people employ is to do a 270-degree kind of a fixation, where you do a lateral fixation and the ipsilateral upside posterior fixation, and leave the bottom screws. You don't do that because you have to get a difficult trajectory.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is one option also.
Thank you. So
mechanically, the best is posterior still, compared to until it works out better, or they put some study and do it. Posterior is definitely better in listhesis.
But if you look at all the Chinese literature, they have done hundreds of standalone OLIF.
So you have to decide whether listhesis is enough or not. See, that is deep force. If you just do it for scoliosis, where listhesis is not so important, maybe standalone might also do the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So after a great complication and avoidance presentation, I would like to take this last question about the what are in the clinical practice of all of you. First, I would like to ask to Dr. Panigari. So what is the most common complication in your practice with the OLIF?
There is hyposthesia at the anterolateral part of thigh. invariably means at least half of my patients have complained, and but then it comes down by 1 month, they're happy, but 6 to 10% they persist. So that is the most
any comment about the subtle weakness on the ipsilateral side of the psoas?
Yeah, the psoas weakness, as I told you, if you have done a lot of retraction of the muscle, then they have temporary weakness which recovers. Means the reported incidence of weakness in literature is 2 to 4%, and I also had one person, but that they usually before discharge he was fine. So I never had a significant problem of weakness, motor weakness, but sensory is a significant problem.
Thank
And
you.
one patient
Dr.
had
Chandra?
a sympathetic.
Dr. Chandra, please. What do
Yeah,
you?
usually it's the paresthesias only because of the retraction what you have seen there, and before retracting it completely, what we can do is just like in ACDF, we can just elevate a little bit of the psoas muscle, the anterior part of the muscle, so that the more disc space is available, and it won't be very difficult to retract it. So by just elevating a small margin of the anterior border of the psoas with the bipolar, then we can expose a lot of disc space without much of a retraction.
So anything you want to add, Dr. Srikantha, about your experience?
Well, in my experience, I don't know, probably because I dissect all the cases under microscope, and most of the cases genitofemoral nerve is identified and preserved. Probably the second thing, what I would like to say, retraction, is that even though we identify the genitofemoral nerve, we put our I had some images, so we put our first dilator in front of it and enter the disc space. So sometimes the nerve is very, very close to this first dilator. So when we pass the subsequent dilators on top of this, there is a chance that this nerve may get caught in the subsequent dilators when we are putting it. So usually what we do in such cases is we have a long root retractor that is there. We pass that, we retract the psoas muscle on top where we are doing the dilatation, and we retract the psoas muscle over there, so that the subsequent dilators actually go on next to that root retractor, so that the nerve doesn't get caught. So in my experience, I think paresthesias is not the major complications for OLIF, but I've found subsidence to be quite a significant issue. And probably, especially because in the initial phases, probably our case selection was not very adequate. We used to do OLIF in an overzealous manner. And, nowadays, if you see any kind of a facet arthrosis, nowadays, if you see any kind of a chronic disease, where you expect the residual compressive forces, because OLIF is a procedure where we are preserving each and every ligament of the spinal column, right from supraspinous, interspinous, your ligamentum flavum, your capsular ligaments, your PLL, your ALL, all the ligaments are preserved. So in a chronic disease, especially, you expect that all these ligaments are likely to have some kind of they tend to go back to their play, to the original situation, what it was, like whether it was a listhesis, whether it was a disc space collapse. So the reverse compressive forces are too much. So unless you have done a good amount of a release in an OLIF procedure, in a chronic case, and especially in those cases, the incidence of subsidence has been quite bad. And though subsidence is related to the amount of disc space preparation, the significance to the severity of osteoporosis, I feel this also is a very significant contributing factor to post-operative cage subsidence.
Rakesh, please.
Okay, so sorry for the long discussion, Jayesh. So after the knowledgeable discussion, I'm sure that all the participants of this session today would be enlightened with the tremendous amount of knowledge which is shared. I'm very sure this will help each one of us in one way or other during our surgical procedures. I would like to thank all the panelists, all the speakers, and the participants. Thank you again. And I would like to hand over to Dr. Ved Prakash for the next session moderation. Thank you all. Thanks a lot.